This program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Welcome, everybody, to WatchMojo's Inside Podcast series. So, joining us today, joining Rob and myself, Ash, this week is Brendan Kelly. So Brendan Kelly is author of Habs Nation, A People's History of the Montreal Canadiens. Now, if you're tuning in and you're wondering, why are Rob and Ash talking about the Habs after covering the state of America, capitalism, censorship, and last week AI? Well, for one, we're based in Montreal. We've never really promoted the fact that we're based in Montreal, but we obviously watch Mojo. We cover sports, and the Habs are experiencing a bit of a renaissance. You know, I'm very lucky. I started following the team in 1986 when they won their 23rd Stanley Cup, and then we won a 24th Stanley Cup in 1993, making us the most successful hockey team. And, you know, we've covered obviously the Habs when we've done sports lists, but we've always tried to stay objective. But with the beginning of the 2025-26 series, you know, Brendan and I have been, you know, as fans and people in media, we exchange thoughts. And for a few months, we're like, hey, we should have you on and discuss it. And so Brendan was gracious enough to actually cover WatchMojo for the Gazette maybe 5-6 years ago when we did the lineup trivia show. And we stayed in touch since then. So on that note, Brendan, welcome to the show. Rob, always nice to see you.
Thanks a lot for the invite, Ash. Happy to be here. Hey, great to meet you, Rob. And hey, I think talking about the Habs, I mean, there's an international side to the Habs. I mean, I think they are arguably the most famous hockey team in the world. So it kind of makes sense.
Despite what some people in Toronto would want to say, or even in New York with the Rangers. But no, I mean, I think, you know, at WatchMojo, when we tackle any topic, we try to be objective. We try to look at, you know, like facts and, you know, stats and all that. But there is always an element of subjectiveness. I won't lie. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Habs are arguably not just the most successful hockey team of all time, just straight up based on the cups. But I think there's an argument to be made about, you know, where are the Habs compared to, say, the Yankees or Real Madrid or the Lakers and many other great sports franchises. So I wanted to touch on that to start off with. I wanted to put the story, the incredible story of the Montreal Canadiens, which goes back 100 plus years, on a global context. And where do you put the Habs versus, say, the Yankees, Real Madrid, FC Barcelona, Bayern Munich? And again, you could run down the sports. Where are the Habs? Like, we're known for our top 10 list. Do the Habs make your top 10 list of the most kind of not valuable in terms of just valuation, but like respect, you know, the combination of athletic success, financial performance, but it is a business, legacy, players, you know, like where do you put the Habs compared to like the Cowboys and, you know, all these other teams?
You know, I think, I mean, and you're right. You know, we're here in Montreal. We're Habs fans. We live in that world. The Habs are so huge here. But, you know, internationally, it's a different story. But I'd say they are top 10. They're floating around the top 10. I mean, the caveat is that, you know, hockey is, in terms of the world, a kind of marginal sport, right? I mean, the number one sport is football, or as we call it in North America, soccer. That's huge everywhere. And hockey isn't, right? Hockey is only big in North America, of course, and in sort of Northwestern Europe, well, the Northern Europe and in Russia and those kinds, very specific kinds of countries. So that's a knock against the Habs in that sense. And, you know, even baseball's probably a more international sport. And, you know, like arguably number one on that list might be Barcelona FC. You know, number two is probably Man United. So those legendary European football teams. But you know what? If you look at hockey, I mean, you mentioned the 24 Stanley Cups, so they've won way more cups than anyone else. And I think if you were to ask people around the world if they knew a hockey team, I mean, let's be serious here. They're not going to say the San Jose Sharks. they might say the Toronto Maple Leafs, but they're probably, if they know a hockey team, it's probably going to be the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, I remember being, I'm originally from Scotland, and I was there a few years ago, and I would meet people who are into hockey. I mean, obviously, again, in Scotland, the sport is football, but, and they knew the Canadians. So they're on that list, and you do see it, you see it's a kind of identifiable brand. I mean, it's funny in a way, like the Montreal Expos, the baseball team that sadly left Montreal in 2004, that logo and that name has a certain resonance around the world, but the Canadien does too. And I think the jersey, but hockey, as I say, is a marginal sport. I mean, if you're going down to Argentina or you're in Asia, people are not watching, they're not playing hockey. But if there is one team that's there, so I say if they make the top 10, maybe number 10.
It's funny because Rob is wearing the jersey. Now, Rob, you wouldn't define yourself as a hardcore Habs fan, right? Like
I used to be much more of a hardcore Habs fan back when I had more time. But over the years, I've kind of drifted a little bit. But, it's still very important to me. I do live around Montreal, and it's part of the culture here. So it's not really something that you can escape. And it is a pleasure to have a team locally that has such a rabid fan following too. So that's always fun.
The interesting thing, if you bridge what you gentlemen both said, is I think Brendan, you're absolutely right. I don't think hockey would even be, probably a top 10 sport in the world, but you can make the case that hockey is not a top 10 global sport. That I don't think is a shocking statement. And while I think some of it is weather and climate, like obviously, I also think there's like the social barrier. Hockey is just getting the equipments each year, you outgrow them, the costs and all that. Just you got to put on the skates. There's a lot going on before you could even, participate. Whereas like football, soccer is you just need a ball, and kids in Brazil play on dirt. Basketball is super popular and became really popular in inner cities with the younger kids because, again, you just needed hoops. So I think some of the hurdle for hockey's growth is that there is a barrier to get there. But then, Rob, what's funny is, I'm not saying you're a bandwagon guy at all.
No, far from it. In fact, I was, this is a Saku Koivu jersey. Yeah. I've been a fan since I was 10 years old. So,
And those were the worst years too. Saku was great, but that was not a winning team.
But that's the thing, like at WatchMojo, I'm 47, as I said, I was 8 when the Habs won in 86. So it was like a first impression was, wow, this is amazing. And we'll talk a little bit about the Canadiens' golden era, and we'll talk about the history. We'll talk about your books. But the point wasn't that Rob was a bandwagon guy. It's like there is a change in the scenery again. The Habs are important again. And like for the 20 years that I've ran WatchMojo, we have these like great memories of like with the guys going to a bar, watch the game. We've seen many games in Montreal. We've seen many games in Toronto when we were on business trips. But yeah, the problem was the product sucked. It sucked for many reasons we'll touch on. But so, yeah, I think though, if we had to do, as like a kind of editor at large at WatchMojo, I think it's hard when it comes to teams to not think of either the Yankees, or I would put even Real Madrid above FC Barcelona and Manchester United, even though I recognize that the Premiership is the biggest league. And then even the Dallas Cowboys. But it's funny, when we put the NFL as the top league, not because, we were like, okay, well, we're still, America is our main market. Understandably, a lot of our global viewers push back saying, no, Premiership is bigger. But then the problem is, how big is soccer in America, which is the biggest market in the world? And there it's where it fizzles. Okay. But yeah, I do think, though, that if we wanted also to represent many sports, it's not the bias. I don't really see how you would put the Rangers or the Leafs just because like they have a higher valuation. That reflects the markets that they're in, which now takes me to the next point. One of the things that makes the Canadiens very unique or distinct is their place in this community. And so I wanted to just get your thoughts on a little bit. Like I used to joke that like Jeff Molson, the owner of the Habs, is like the Pope here because the Habs are like religion. It's the Vatican. It's like that's, he may not be running the most valuable business in Montreal, but he definitely runs the most iconic one, right? So in your opinion, as a journalist, written a couple books on the team, what is the root of that uniqueness or their distinct role in the community and the city?
Well, you know what? And I think Barcelona is a really good comparison in that sense. Is that what's unique about Montreal and the Montreal Canadiens is the team was created for a specific community. And I love this story, and I recount it in my book, that Ambrose O'Brien, an English Canadian businessman from small town Ontario, he came to Montreal in 1909 and he just saw a business opportunity. He said, okay, there's the Shamrocks, a team for the Irish community. There's the Wanderers, a team for the English community. He said, we don't have a team for the French Canadians in Montreal. So he started Le Canadien. And it's interesting to note that in 1909, Canadien meant not Canadian, but French Canadian. So, you know, as someone said to me, if they created the team today, it would be the Montreal Québécois, because that's what we call the people here now. And so that's what really sets Montreal apart and why it has such a, you know, and again, if you live in Montreal, you know this, but we're speaking to people all over the world. There's a resonance here with the team. So with the three of us are maybe hockey fans, but there's a lot of people that don't watch hockey. But when things get hot, like for example, in 2021, when they go to the Stanley Cup final just at the end of COVID, the whole of society gets into it. Like it's everyone's talking about it and it means something. And it's also wrapped up in the French heritage. I mean, there's not many French players now. They used to be called the Flying Frenchmen, but that's still a thing. You know, it's Les Canadiens. There's, you know, if you think about Quebec and you think about French Canada, what are the cultural entities? What are the things that people most identify with? There's not even any debate. It's the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, they like their government perhaps, but it's a friggin' government, you know, but I
don't think anybody likes the government.
No, you're right. Actually, that's the wrong thing. But you know, they liked when the Quiet Revolution and the French took more power in the government. But it's like there's no question that the Canadians here has a resonance, and it really is different. Like in Toronto, for example, they love the Toronto Maple Leafs and they live and die with them. They mostly lose with them because they're a kind of loser team, as we know. But you know, but it's true, right? I mean, they haven't had a lot of success since 1967, but they're just a hockey team. The Montreal Canadiens are a hockey team, of course, and you know, they were a kind of losing team for a long time too. But there's something else there, and it's interesting because it's the French thing, but it means the same. I mean, in a different way for English people. So it means a lot to people here, and it goes beyond sports.
Yeah, so you touched on so many great points. I think the Barcelona-Montreal analogy with the Catalan dialect and region, and the Quebec distinct kind of unique flavor to the province or state, you know, for reference. I agree, that's a great one. Now, what's interesting, you mentioned language, and we'll come back to it because I do want to talk a little bit. You know, I was always very curious as to why would a Brendan Kelly care so much about the Québécois DNA. So we'll come on that. But one thing that's fascinating to me is, sure, in the last 20 years when the Habs sucked, I personally, perfectly bilingual, I totally understand the reason why many Québécois want to even have their own country. Like it's culture, languages, communication. That's not, you know, I'm proud Canadian. I'm not a separatist at all, but I do understand. But in the last 20 years as a Habs fan, I didn't care. I didn't care if the coach was from Mars. I didn't care if the goalie was from Senegal, because the Habs just really were not good. And I don't think the management overall was that good. I don't think the ownership deserved high grades. I don't think the GM or president or coaches did. So to me, there was just so many fundamental problems. And you mentioned the Leafs. Yeah, the reason why I think the Leafs have a problem is organizational. You know, it does start with that. It's top down. Yes. But yeah, the difference is like Toronto. After you mentioned the Quiet Revolution and all that, all the businesses that went to Toronto ultimately shaped that city. It's a business city. It tries to have culture. I don't shit on Toronto. It's not Montreal. I think for Americans, Toronto is more like a Chicago. Montreal is more like a Boston, right? And there's only one New York. But what I wanted to say was there's so much going on that when you go to a Leafs game, it's not a myth that it's a corporate thing. It's very corporate. You go to the Habs, even if you're sitting fairly low, close to the ice, it's a lot of fans. Even if there are people who are business people, you know, have their season tickets, everybody's wearing a jersey. You know what I mean? Whereas when you're in Toronto, I saw one game there and I got it, you know. And then I think the other thing is like a few years ago, you mentioned if you're like a global person, Would they say the Leafs? Maybe they'll say the LA Kings. I remember when Snoop Dogg showed up with a Canadiens jersey, and I was like, wow, we take it for granted. But I think it's also like New York is an extreme example. LA is the same. There's so much else going on. Like when we sponsored the Islanders, it was because I recognized like, oh, here it's a major league. So we get associate ourselves like with a big deal. It was also New York. The Islanders at the time were playing in Brooklyn where all the media folks are. So it was easy to take people out. But the Islanders were like the 17th choice if you're looking to sponsor. You got the Yankees, the Giants, the Jets, the Rangers. I mean, even the Devils might be higher. So I think some of it is, and I hate to admit this, it's like that Montreal has seen 30, 40 years of decline. It's not a political statement. It's just fundamentally Montreal is not what it was. And the only constant are the Habs. That's all there is to it. So I want to switch gears. We'll talk a little bit about the French factor later on again. There's a very interesting stat. I hope I don't forget it. But I do want to switch gears. We touched on organizations. So when I started WatchMojo, George Gillette had an American businessman had bought the team at a time when there was nobody in Montreal with the capacity or the vision or the desire to really step up, right? So there was this American who came. There wasn't a revolt. I think the citizens understood that it's a business. And he kind of did a good job. I think he developed Gillette Entertainment, which became Evenco, which is why the Bell Center in Montreal is the second most busy arena after the Madison Square Garden, which is insane. But I want your thoughts on Jeff Molson. So Jeff Molson bought the team with his brother and a consortium of investors. Since he's been the owner on the ice, financially, if you want, brand, hiring, in the community, what's your feedback on his tenure? What grade would you give him?
Well, I give him a pretty good grade right now. I mean, if you think about it, it was 2009 when he bought the team, and he bought the team for what was it?
600 million.
About 600, and George Gillette had bought it for about 180. So Gillette made a handy profit, which then he all lost with Liverpool, and when he went into the ownership there. But now so firstly, financially, you got to give Jeff Molson whatever AAA+ it's worth. We don't know what exactly it's worth. 3
Yeah, 2.4 billion probably.
Right. So that's unbelievable. I mean, to think about that from 600 to 2.4. And at the same time, they're racking in the money. They're selling more jerseys, more merch than ever. Every game is sold out in a 21,000 seat arena. And the merch thing is huge, because we've got these young stars like the new Russian phenom, Ivan Demidov. Apparently, the day he arrived at the end of last season, the jersey sales are off the charts. And it's going to be the same thing for the young defenseman, Lane Hudson. But so financially, for sure, A++. But the first decade was difficult. There's no question about it. And I mean, the first thing that Jeff Molson did was hire Marc Bergevin. And listen, when he hired Marc Bergevin as general manager in 2012, it really seemed like a good idea, right? You remember, Ash, people were very enthused. The media was very enthused, but it went south pretty quickly, And I mean, look, contributing factor was the team was built around Carey Price. He hurt himself. He never really fully came back after that injury in the 2014 playoffs. So it was pretty up and down, with Gus up to not so great in those years. But what I got to say now is when Jeff Molson finally fired Bergevin as GM and hired the new management team of Jeff Gorton and Kent Hughes, so a kind of two-headed monster. I mean, the success hasn't come yet, but it's the first real rebuild in the history of the Canadiens. And I don't listen really to the Montreal media so much on this because, they're so wrapped up in the Habs. But even if you look at places like The Athletic and in the American hockey media, they're saying, this is a really promising team. It seems to be really well built around a good core. So, there's a vision there now that's we'll see if it's paying off. But I mean, because you've also got to say, you've got to situate Jeff Molson as an owner with and again, that's kind of the story of my book from 1995 to 2021. I mean, it's not a well-managed team. There's no two ways about it. And I think they're more promising now than they have been at any time since the late 80s and 90s. So it's been a pretty bad period. I think, the kudos I would give to Jeff Molson, one, I would say, for buying the team. I mean, there's a great story. His dad, Eric Molson, was involved when Molson owned it way back in the 80s. And when Jeff went to his dad and he said, I've got this consortium and me and my brothers are buying the team, Eric said, don't do it. You're crazy, and because he said you'll lose money. And look, he had the vision to do this, and it's financially turned out great. And it's turning around on the ice as well. So at the end of the day, I mean, it looks pretty good right now. But the great thing about sports is, it's not a matter of opinion, right? Like the greatest team in hockey right now is the Florida Panthers. It is. I mean, they won 2 straight Stanley Cups and they were in the final the year before that. So the proof is there on the ice. So we got to see. Everything looks to be in place, but you know what? They got into the playoffs finally last year. But no, I give high marks to Jeff Molson in the sense that he backed Bergevin. He did back Bergevin too long, but then he finally saw in 2021, I've got to move on, and he made some really smart decisions in terms of the people he got to run the team. So it's looking good right now.
It's funny because as an entrepreneur, I've met a lot of, so there's a saying, but by the way, I agree. I love Jeff Molson. I think he gets very high marks. The only reason I wouldn't give him like an A or A plus is because, yeah, you're right. They have to win. But if he was a B plus, let's say he's edging very quickly into the A minus territory and it's going up. Now, let me just put that in context. So the funny thing is, Barry Switzer, when he was coaching the Oklahoma college football team before going on to coach the Dallas Cowboys, he coined the term, some athletes are born on third base, like meaning they think they hit a triple, to get to there, close to scoring, say, a run, but they're actually born on third base. And that's not anybody's fault, right? Like you don't choose who your parents are. And so as an entrepreneur, I don't view myself self-made. I stand on other people's shoulders as well. My dad, my brother, many advisors over the years, but okay, my last name's not Molson. So in my journey as an entrepreneur, I was always like running into being introduced to a lot of so-called born on third base young entrepreneurs, like people whose dad or grandfather built the business. They now had like the entrepreneurial drive and, trying to be modest and humble and always seeing people's good traits. I kind of initially in my career, and there's a parallel with Jeff here, early on in my career, I would kind of like not roll my eyes, but be kind of doubtful, not cynical, not sarcastic, but I would be like, if you really don't have that drive or that hunger, or like you have this like urge because there's no plan B, you're going to kind of really be persistent and resilient to succeed, right? So at first, I used to think a lot of people who were born and then wanted to do something, it was more vanity and ego. But whenever I meet somebody, I have an open mind. So Jeff, I think, as a guy that studies leadership and management, I think Jeff, from a leadership perspective, the thing that I find fascinating and helped him is, I think when he started off, because he also had studied business and he wasn't just some kid who was rich with a big name. And to his credit, yeah, he went and he raised investment. It wasn't like his dad just was like, here's $1 billion, go waste it. Right. So I think he didn't necessarily know what his strengths were. Like I know what my strengths are, I know what my weaknesses are, and I build accordingly. But I think he earnestly, because he's a great human being, he's a good fan. Like I think that as Montrealers like that, he's a fan and a good person to begin with. I think he maybe made some decisions, not in bad faith, but where he was still trying to figure out like my yin to whoever yang. And I understand why he went with Bergevin, and I understand because of the French factor. These are things that are only pertinent in Montreal. You mentioned, Gorton and Hughes. We're very, very lucky to have them. But if we're going to be candid, the only reason why he needed to go and bring in a Kent Hughes is because Kent Hughes is bilingual, whereas Jeff Gorton is an American who doesn't speak, and that would have been a bit thorny, right? So there's this added thing where I felt the Habs were always like a hand tied behind their back because, yeah, the coach should speak French. I mean, to me, the coach, every game, you have press conferences. I never felt the GM needed, to be candid, really be bilingual. But something happened, and I don't know, it wasn't one event, but it's as if when he saw, I hired Bergevin, I'm sticking to my guns, but I'm not getting the outcome I want. And what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing, expecting a different result. Something clicked. Like eventually, if they read his bio, something happened where he changed, I feel. Like he did, as a guy, I met him a few times. I don't pretend to know him, but it's as if he kind of realized what his strengths were, and he was kind of like, I do need a Gorton. Obviously a Hughes as a GM. And then things started to fall into place dramatically. And we were kind of blessed with that pandemic run to the Stanley Cup Finals, which was just a bizarre era to put it all together. But I just give them credit for even things like bringing in Chantal Machabé to manage the communications with like the media and all that. Like they just think of these small. Yeah, you were going to say. I feel you were going to.
Well, I just think that there's a change in the culture. There really was, and I think you really hit on something very interesting, Ash, which is something did happen. They went on that incredible run in 2021, made it to the Stanley Cup final with that weird COVID year with all these different rules. But I mean, frankly, it was almost a fluke, and they won those series, so you can't take that away from them. But then in November of that year, something happened. They had a terrible start to the year, but Jeff Molson finally realized we have to move on from Marc Bergevin. And not only that, but we have to go with, and again, you're totally right, with what we call the kind of two-headed monster. So now, and he just got promoted to president of hockey operations, Jeff Gorton, guy from Boston, does not speak much French. An American, a very, very seasoned manager, was with the Bruins, also with the New York Rangers. Yeah. And then they got Kent Hughes, an Anglophone, an English-speaking guy from the West Island of Montreal, but who's fluent in French and speaks very good French with a big accent, which is fine. And but also they changed the culture. Chantal Machabé, I mean, it's funny to talk even about PR because who cares, but it's important. And she's a very respected broadcaster who was with the sports channel RDS for years and years. And she's really changed the culture. I mean, they used to not make the players available to any TV shows, and they had this sort of siege mentality. The media is the enemy, the stupidest way of looking at the world possible, because everyone loves the Habs. I mean, what are you talking about, And so she finally sort of got the Habs players to appear on shows like Tout le monde en parle, which is the top-rated talk show on Radio Canada, the public broadcaster here. And she's changed the culture. And something has happened, which is very significant, which is, I was just writing about this week in my Gazette column about how they're more in touch with the community. I just saw Cole Caulfield. I live in the neighborhood of NDG. I saw him in the supermarket. Like, he's out in the community. My son lives in Old Montreal, and he sees Cole. He sees Slavkovsky. These guys are out there. They go to the Lasso and Oceaga festivals, and it's not insignificant. There's also a sense in the team of togetherness, which is great. So that creates a winning culture. So Jeff Molson is behind all of this, and you got to give him credit. He really the team today, in terms of that sense of a winning culture, of a sense of community, of a sense of understanding they're in Montreal. This is something that was totally absent 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think, there was also maybe a realization that not everybody needs to be a French speaker. We could poop on Marc Bergevin's tenure. He was genius at going to find a random third line or fourth liner, even what we needed first. But at the end of the day, he pulled the trade to bring in Nick Suzuki, who's now our captain, who is just an outstanding human being. We're so lucky to have him. And I do think that, that trade, which predates the Hughes or the Hugo era, set the tone, so to speak. And then when he signed that contract and then everything else that has flowed, it's just amazing. Now, last year, I was at a game, and I just had flashbacks to 93 and 86. And yes, obviously the quality of all the players has gone up. But I was like, if you think of those 86 and 93 teams, this team is more stacked. And I used to tell people even a couple of years ago, I was like, it's premature. They're in a rebuild. But I'm like, we've always, like, the Habs, one year they went out and they signed 5 free agents, Gionta, Gomez, and Camilleri, and it was a bit random because they were trying to kind of put 9 women in a room and say, give birth in a month. You're like, you can't build culture like that. But what's incredible is I was like, wow, we really have the right defensemen. We really have the right forwards. It's really like their ages are coming up together. And I think you're seeing it now. And there's this excitement around the league when even the Toronto media groups, cohorts are like admitting that, the Habs actually have a better future. So I want to talk a little bit. We'll come back to the French factor, and I do want to talk a little bit about just the future of the Habs, where they stand. But where do you compare, the Habs in the 50s? They won from 55 to 60 5 times in a row.
Right.
In the 70s, they won 4 times in a row. And with Ken Dryden, one of our all-time great goalies, passing away, he won like 6 cups in 8 years in the 70s, which is insane. How do you, as somebody that's studied the history, let's start off just with those 2 eras because they were dominant. What are your thoughts on, adjusted for physicality? I get it. But which team, in your opinion, was more dominant, that 50s team or the 70s dynasty?
Well, you know what? They are amongst the greatest teams in hockey. I mean, there's you mentioned Ken Dryden, and he wrote a great book, which anyone who's got an interest in hockey should have a look at, called Scotty, and a profile. It wasn't just a profile, but it was about Scotty Bowman, who was the great coach, one of the greatest coaches in the history of hockey, and was coaching the team for much of the 1970s. And in that book, they go through who was the greatest team of all time. And they end up, and I forget if it's 76, I think 76, 77.
77, they won 68 and 12. That's undisputable. It's
unbelievable. And, Boston Bruins had this great run a few years ago where they almost had the same kind of stats, but they lost in the first round. And that year, Montreal won the Stanley Cup. So I think it's those 70s teams. I mean, the 50s teams is amazing. I mean, 55 to 60, 5 straight Stanley Cups. And, that's the team led by Maurice Richard. He was in he didn't create, but the Maurice Richard riot the year before when he was suspended, huge moment actually in Quebec history. And he just stormed back and they won 5. But you know what? In the 70s, they won 6 cups. You think of the cup that they won, I mean, considered one of the greatest sort of upsets in the history of hockey, 1971, when they go up against the Boston Bruins, and the Boston Bruins are just talking about stacked. Bobby Orr, Phil Esposito, the goalies, Jerry Cheevers. They won in 70. They won again in 72. They should have won in 71, but a young goalie named Ken Dryden suddenly appeared, who played 6 regular season games. And I remember talking to Scotty Bowman for my book, and he wasn't coaching them. He started the next year. He said Ken Dryden won that series single-handedly, and then they went on to win those 4 straight at the end of the 70s. To me, and you think about that team, so the leading light, of course, is Guy Lafleur, so one of the greatest players in the history of hockey and the history of the Canadiens. But the supporting cast, I mean, oh my God. I mean, you've got Jacques Lemaire, you've got Steve Shutt. I talk about supporting cast. I mean, guy often scored
goals. He scored 60 goals twice.
Yeah, unbelievable. And they talk about the big 3 on defense, Serge Savard, Guy Lapointe, and Larry Robinson. And then in the nets is Ken Dryden. I mean, like you say, Ken Dryden won 6 Stanley Cups in 8 seasons. And we say 8 seasons. One of the seasons he only played 6 games. And often enough, he was sitting there bored at the other end of the ice because the team was so unbelievable. So I don't think, that's one of the problems in Montreal, is for those of us who grew up in the 70s. I was a kid in that era. You got so used to the team winning that once you went through, even the 80s seemed really bad and they still won a cup. Then the 90s, they still won a cup. But then you go 30 years since and you're like, oh my God, like I was lived in a world where, the mayor of Montreal at the time in the 70s, Jean Drapeau, used to say, the parade will follow the usual route. I don't even need to tell you where it is. You know where it is. It's going to start at the Forum and go down St. Catherine Street. I mean, those teams were, it was almost crazy, right? Like, and it also shows how hockey has changed, because there's no teams like that now. There's no team like the Canadiens. You just like virtually like one year, whatever, they lost like 8 games. I mean, it's you're never going to see that again. That was just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's funny because I think it's not a shocking statement to say that like a turning point in the Habs history was obviously 95, Detroit, Montreal. Patrick Roy goes to then President Ronald Corey. He and Mario Tremblay, the coach at the time, were roommates when they played. And here you have Patrick Roy, who's like this all-star. And Mario Tremblay, a bit like Marc Bergevin, is a 3rd and 4th liner. So it's kind of like, there's probably egos, and that's just human nature. It is what it is. It's in the past. But yeah, so Patrick Roy leaving, I think, started the dark ages for the Habs. So you mentioned Dryden, and obviously before there was Jacques Plante, George Hainsworth one year at 22 wins and 22 shutouts, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around. But if somebody came to you, and obviously we were lucky to have Carey Price, 5th pick overall in 2005, who went on to have a great career. He never won the cup, maybe a reflection of the team. He won with Team Canada. He won in the juniors. He won every other thing he could. Who's the greatest Canadiens goaltender of all time, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a tough one. Jacques Plante was great, but of course you kind of look at the goalies that you actually watch. So to me, it's between Ken Dryden and Patrick Roy. And I got a soft spot for Patrick Roy because this guy was, like we say in good Quebecois, un vrai winner. This guy he was just gonna win. And you think about 86 and 93, and it's not fair to say those were the 2 cup wins, both with the first one, Patrick Roy was a rookie. But to me, that guy he just, remember what he said in 1993 when they did, and I mean, we're throwing out, incredible stats, 10 straight overtime wins in the playoffs. Again, don't worry about ever seeing that again. It's not going to friggin' happen. And he said to them, just get me to overtime and I won't let in a goal. He had that kind of, and one of the things I love about sports, right, is so much of it is personality. Like, I'm just going to win this game, and I remember for my book talking to Denny Savard, who was playing with the team in 93, and he goes to Patrick and he says, oh my God, because he was with the Chicago Blackhawks for years and they had really good teams. And every year they'd meet the Edmonton Oilers with Wayne Gretzky and they would always lose in the playoffs because that team was so incredible. And he says, oh my God, Patrick, I'm meeting Gretzky again because it was the Canadiens against the Los Angeles Kings. And by then Gretzky was with the Kings. And Patrick Roy says, so don't worry. He says, I'm winning this series. And that was the kind of guy he was. And look, they made that idiotic trade that you mentioned, traded him to the Colorado Avalanche for nothing. Like got, back.
Martin Ruzinski and something else. But Andrei Kovalenko.
Listen, Thibault was a decent goalie, but it's an absurd trade. It's an idiotic trade. And Patrick Roy goes on to immediately win a cup with Colorado. They had a good team. They just were missing a great goalie. And he won another 2 cups. So he won 2 cups with Montreal, and he was just such a fierce competitor. Though, we're talking about comparing the goalies. But again, if someone were to tell me I believe it's Ken Dryden, I wouldn't be upset with that concept. He was a pretty incredible goalie. And again, and WatchMojo is big on stats and lists. 6 cups in 8 years. It's just, again, no one's going to do that today. No one.
Yeah,
Could I jump in for a quick question for Brendan? So we've been talking about the Canadiens' cultural importance and representing French Canadians and stuff within the NHL. And as the league continues to expand and emphasize American teams over Canadian teams, and also the fact that next week we're covering the Montreal Expos in our podcast, there's another professional sports team that disappeared from Quebec, the Nordiques. In your mind, is there a space for 2 French Canadian teams in the NHL, or is this really where Montreal has just sucked all of the air out of the room and become the team that represents this part of the country?
Well, you know what? First off, it's just such a horrible thing to lose a much loved sports franchise, right? You're mentioning you're going to talk about the Expos. 2004, we're still grieving that here in Montreal, and the Nordiques in 95. And you know what? That the what we call La Bataille de Quebec, the Battle of Quebec, that was the greatest rivalry ever in the NHL, and it was so great and it was so good. I don't think it's so much a matter of the Canadiens sucking all the air out of the room, because I know that if the Quebec Nordiques return tomorrow, and I don't believe they'll ever come back, honestly, but because Gary Bettman and the NHL do not want that. But if the Nordiques return tomorrow, 1/3 of Quebec immediately would become Nordiques fans. All of the people outside Montreal would be only too happy to do it. I think lots of them anyways. It's interesting because Montreal played an exhibition game at the Centre Videotron in Quebec City a couple of weeks ago. and all of the fans were rabidly cheering the Habs. So they switched over their loyalties, but they would be back in a sec with the Nordiques. I think the problem, I mean, Ash was talking about, the decline of Montreal. There's no money in Quebec City, right? I mean, there's no industry in Quebec City. I suppose it could have a team, but the problem is, like, they're talking that the next expansion team is going to be Atlanta. I mean, ça n'a aucun sens, as we say around these parts. Atlanta's had two teams and they both failed. But Gary Bettman and this NHL, one of the most significant events, and I guess it was just around 93, early 90s, I guess, that the head office of the NHL moved from Montreal to New York, and that changed everything. Their whole focus is on America, the United States, and their whole focus is, look what they did with the Phoenix Coyotes and then later the Arizona Coyotes. They spent, over $100 million or just a crazy amount of money. They just wanted to make that team happen no matter what, even though there was so little financial support for it. So sadly, there's not going to be another team in Quebec. But even in Canada, I mean, look at Ontario. I mean, there is no question. Anyone in hockey would tell you, you put a team in Scarborough tomorrow or in Hamilton, and remember for years, the guy from Blackberry was trying to get a team in Hamilton. You could easily have a third Ontario hockey team after Toronto and Montreal, but I don't see Bettman doing it. He doesn't like supporting Canada.
So I don't disagree, but just to add a little bit of context. So I don't think, Rob, personally, I don't think it's so much that the Canadians suck all the energy out of the room, so to speak, because growing up, we had the oddball classmate that was rooting for the Bruins in Montreal. So
we all had that friend who was.
We all had that one friend, and we're like, what drama occurred? But anyway, so I do think though that there's three issues with the Nordiques. One, as Brendan said, it's a tiny market. You go to Quebec, you're there one night, 2 nights, that's it. There's nothing. It's a beautiful city, but there's no industry. And you go to any arena, corporate suites, upselling, more perks, buy more expensive beer and whatever. So Quebec would just not support that. 2, you mentioned Jim Balsillie, the BlackBerry co-founder. I've never met him, but he was seen as like an arrogant business guy, which rubbed off a lot of people. Let's be candid. Pierre-Carl Pelado is another so-called born on third base fella who, like Jeff Molson, could have never worked a day in his life and just live a very good life. And I give them credit that they both are tremendously ambitious. Pierre-Carl built up the company Quebecor that he inherited from his dad to even loftier heights by buying Videotron, yada, yada. He was the person behind the Nordiques' attempt to come back. I don't think that the owners really, even that would be sympathetic, would love to have a separatist owner in like the backyard of the Montreal Canadiens, which are still like a nice story and whatnot. And then, the third one, you could disagree. Atlanta, Houston will also get a team. My point is there's many, many other teams in the States that I think Gary Bettman, the commissioner, would rather go with before Quebec even comes in the conversation. So I don't think Quebec's ever going to get a team, not because of lack of merit, but unfortunately, just a reflection. And as a guy that used to host a show on the station where the Montreal Expos played and tried before they moved to get like business owners to consider, buying them to keep them, it's not the same mindset, there's not all these billionaire owners that are going to step up, write that check. And then, so I think the Quebec, unfortunately, the Nordiques are never going to come back. Next week, I'll give you my 2 cents on whether the Expos will ever come back. But just to go back to sports a little bit, but we can talk about business as well quite a bit. But the reason why I asked you about the goalies is because I don't think there is actually a clear-cut answer for the greatest goalie of all time with the Habs for all the reasons you said. I think you could make the argument. I don't think it would be convincing. You can even make the argument for Carey Price because he was just such a physical, like great tactical and, like 1 year.
And he never had the team. He never had the
team. That's what I'm saying. That like he gets an asterisk because he never won the cup, but he never had the support. And he didn't single-handedly get us to 21, but he played a big part. But my point was, an argument could be made for Carey Price. An argument certainly can be made for Patrick Roy, that swagger, Jacques Plante, Ken Dryden. I think statistically, Ken Dryden's run with the team gives them the edge. But I think Patrick Roy in his career to then go to Colorado, I'll love that line with Jeremy Roenick. He was like, yeah, I don't hear what Jeremy Roenick says because I got a bunch of Stanley Cup rings in my ear. I love that swagger. But the thing as a guy, again, as an outsider myself, it's so typiquement Montrealais that Roy had to leave to go to Colorado and win 2 more times to really be viewed as one of the all-time GOATs. You know, I think if he would have stayed in Montreal, whether he would have only won 2 or won a third, doubtful. I don't think that people would have necessarily given him the same kind of track record that he earned once he went to, I remember even John Elway being asked like, hey, there's this new gunslinger in town, this goalie named Patrick Roy. And so I think that helped his profile in the end. But I think if you look at with the team, it's probably Dryden in my humble opinion. Now, the juxtaposition is, I agree with you. I think that 70s dynasty was clearly the best team of all time for all the reasons you said. But I do think that, as much as Guy Lafleur is an all-time leading scorer, great player, nothing to take away from him, I do think that paradoxically, the one player that is most synonymous is Maurice the Rocket Richard, who played in that 50s team. So that's also an interesting, as a fan, as somebody that follows teams and all that, that to me, the all-time GOAT is, maybe it'll be different in 10 years if Demidov wins 5 cups, you know what I mean? But I think if we look at it objectively, the Rocket is the number 1 on the list of greatest Habs players, so to speak. Agree or disagree? You give it to Lafleur?
No, I don't think so. Well, you know what? I think firstly, there's a kind of holy trinity, which is Maurice Richard for the 1950s, Jean Beliveau, Le Gauville for the 60s, and Guy Lafleur for the 70s. And I think it's so interesting because they're all such different characters. So Maurice Richard's the fiery, furious, he's going to punch your head off and then score 5 goals. Jean Beliveau is le gentleman, he's but even the way he plays he could be tough too. And then Guy Lafleur is kind of otherworldly. I think of he's almost he's like a superhero, But I would say I'm with you about Maurice Richard in a couple of, because both on the ice and off the ice. Firstly, he was the greatest player of his era. I guess the Gordie Howe fans would disagree. You could make an argument, but he was a superstar across North America. Another
scored 50 goals in 50. What he did.
First guy to do that.
Yeah, there was the legendary stories of he was moving one day, bringing up his fridge to up the stairs, and he scored 5 goals the next day or 8 points. The stories are insane. But I think you're right, and I think it's all 3 of them were also French, Canadian, Quebecois. So to go back to that point without dwelling on it, because I think everybody's just very happy with where the team is. Do you think, given what I'm not necessarily talking about FC Barcelona or other similar dynamics in Montreal, does winning ultimately solve the language thing? Or even if they win, then, you start to go through, what can I complain about? And then it's like, well, why isn't the goalie French? Or why isn't this defenseman? Or this? Or is ultimately victory the ultimate remedy for all this bitching?
Well, you know what? It's a great question. Serge Savard says, and I forget exactly how he says it, but something to the effect, you can win in English, but you can't lose in English. And that's the point. And you know what? You've done a lot of losing in Montreal in the last 30 years, and it's mostly been in English, So the reality is, you can discount the French Canadian thing as much as you want. The reality is there's only 3 French Canadian players on the team right now: Zachary Bolduc, the goalie Samuel Montembeault, and Alexandre Carrier. These guys, it means something more to them to play for the Canadiens, and it means a lot to the fans, and it means a lot to the media. But you know what? No one's going to be complaining about language if they win the cup. And I think that the other thing too is that, we mentioned that era when the best players were French Canadians, the real heroes: Maurice Richard, Jean Beliveau, then Guy Lafleur, then Patrick Roy, all of the leaders. There were great English players, but the 4 iconic guys from that 40-year period were all French Canadians. Well, that's done. That's finished. There aren't the Quebec is just not producing the players. That's a whole other story. In 1993, there were 14 Quebecois players on that team that won the Stanley Cup. So 14 out of, say, 20, 21, 22. You could not do that today. If you had 14 players from Quebec on your team, you'd be relegated to the American Hockey League. And I'm not saying anything against Quebec. They're just not producing the players like they used to. But it's and they'll never get back to that. And it's but I think that what we'll see, and I think that what we're seeing with this new team, like I was saying earlier, is these guys, Nick Suzuki, as you saw, the captain, guy from London, Ontario, English Canadian, who's not bilingual, did his first ever French language interview. I think the players are going to open up more to not to be fluently bilingual, but to be more in the community, to say a bit of French. I mean, there was a hilarious video this week with that guy, Ivan Demidov, who's going to be a star, maybe even a superstar player, 19-year-old kid from Russia. And they said, and he had a great game, and he scored the tying goal. And they said, what do you want to say to the fans? And he's got a big grin on his face. And he says, Salut les partisans, like there's an openness there. And I think that's all it takes. They don't have to be French, and there just aren't enough French Quebecois players anymore. But you know what people hear, and you guys know this, you live in Quebec, what French people here just want is they want some respect, and they're right to want respect. And if a guy comes, and if Sting comes and he speaks French at the show, right? You're in forever, and that's all they want. They want a bit of respect and say a bit in French. And, look at the reaction to Nick Suzuki speaking French. I mean, oh my God, it was like the second coming.
It's language, it's communication. It's that explains relationships between individuals and groups, and that's how you create culture or whatever. So totally get it. And yeah, it's funny, a couple things, and then I think Rob has a question. But first of all, Bolduc reminds me of Stéphane Richer, who was our last 50-goal scorer. So that's one. Two,
he's a great player.
Great player. And then the other thing you mentioned, even I used the word bitching. I meant just generally as a fan. I didn't at all mean like the Quebecois. I think that I understand. If I'm born in Quebec and I'm Francophone, I understand my, that outlook. What's really, to me, the critical stat is, yes, the Habs have won 24 cups, and even over 110 years. It's an incredible ratio. But they won 6 + 5, at least 11, but maybe even more. I'm missing one. But they won 11 out of 24, at least, maybe even more, from 55 to 79, right? That era,
15.
Yeah, that era was predominantly French-speaking. Now, yes, at the time, only Montreal could draft Quebec players, which seems like criminal. But yeah, no, I totally understand that, like, there is something about pride and all that you cannot discount, you cannot overlook. But then the reality is the backdrop. Now the world has changed. Kids growing up in Quebec don't want to play hockey, and if they do, they're not as good as the kids from Alberta, let alone some from Russia. And I'm not I'm a big hockey guy, but I'm not like a coach. I can't address that. So that era is gone. But looking ahead, what do you think is like a realistic thing for Habs? Like, are we a bit like in delirium and we are just giddy and we are unrealistic? Or do you think that, like, yeah, maybe not to jinx it, but maybe cup number 25 is possible in the next few years?
It is possible. I mean, I think basically the window is like in 2 or 3 years. But I mean, no one can predict a cup, right? But I think what you can say, I would say, and I think a lot of observers are saying that, is they can be a contender. They can go deep into the playoffs with this group. They've got the 6 core people signed till at least 2030, a couple of them even later than that. So they've got a good core in a way they haven't in a long time. And I mean, look, Toronto is their window of opportunity is closing, correct? They've just lost Mitch Marner. They had what's called the Big Four. The most they ever won in 1 year was one playoff series, and often they didn't win any at all. So I think Montreal's moving into a moment where there's going to be an opportunity, but they're not there yet. Like, the stuff has to come together. They need to get a supporting cast. But the other thing that's interesting is
maybe a second center. I mean, they have all the pieces at this point, to be honest. And I also think, no disrespect to Samuel Montembeault, who I think is a very good goalie, I just see a repeat of the Carey Price, Yaroslav Halak dynamic with Dobesh and Fowler. I see those two as the future goalies. Nothing against Montembeault, but just between age and everything else and runway and upside. And that's going to be incredible. Like the team has everything they need, you know?
And also the thing that's interesting is those 6 players, with the exception of Dobson, who's making 9.5, most of them are on very team-friendly deals. So it leaves them other money to say, okay, you know what, we need one 33-year-old guy to be the grizzled veteran winger. And so they've got room for maneuver. They've set this up in a really smart way, and we'll see how it turns out. Because as you say, you got to have a very good goalie. The goalie doesn't have to be the best goalie. And from what I hear, Fowler, the people who watch NCAA hockey regularly in the States are super high on this guy. And no, I think they could be contending in a couple of years, and we'll see where it goes. But I mean, I think there's more excitement about this potential of this team than there has been for any team since the mid-90s.
Yeah, I agree.
We've got a good question from our producer, Yvonne, which I want to get both of your takes on. So ultimately, sports is entertainment, and WatchMojo covers everything entertainment. We want to know what the Habs can teach us about the importance of catering to a smaller and more niche audience, as opposed to a more global audience when it comes to building long-term success as a brand.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, anyone who works in the entertainment business, right, understands this. You start local, right? If you don't have success where you come from, generally you won't have success elsewhere. So they've got incredible success here. It's built, as we've been saying, on a very specific thing, on a specific French identity, very tied to one specific community here in Quebec. And I think that you can grow on that. You know, it's the hurdle is that hockey, as we were saying right off the top, is you know, like probably the sport number 10 around the world. But I think that, you know, you do have, it's a brand. Like, this is a really strong brand, the Montreal Canadiens. I think it is. It's not as well known as the Yankees or Real Madrid or Man U, but they have a great brand there. If they're smart, you build locally and take it global.
So there's also a question about Halifax that we could come to after, but just
sure.
Yeah. So it's funny because to me, again, I'm not a Toronto hater. Like I go Toronto is fine. Toronto thinking it's New York or something or Montreal is farcical. But when I go to the different cities and different arenas, yeah, I do think that the Maple Leafs are always trying to be there, like the Yankees or the Mets or the Giants or the Cowboys. Like they're kind of like, possibly because they haven't won a cup since 1967, although they fielded good teams with Gilmore and, you know, Sundin. I mean, they've had good teams. Even now, this team, I know Marner left, but I mean, they were like a piece away, you could argue. But I never felt that the Leafs were like authentic. What I mean by that is the Habs, for better or worse, it's the Habs. I never go to a Habs game or watch a Habs broadcast. Even in like the dark ages, I never feel like they're faking it or, you know, but partly is because they had this rich history. They have that asset. They have that foundation, right? So the Habs, even if you look at like the Ken Dryden Memorial, simple, beautiful, magical, resonated with the brand, respectful. So I think Montreal, again, Jeff Molson's a smart guy. He has an incredible team. They brought in a president, former lawyer. She's really on the ball. Like I met them a few years ago when we discussed partnering on Just for Laughs. I've told him, I said, I don't understand why you guys are not ambitious globally, you know, because I was like, you're still in a market that is 9 million population. You know, it's not the size of California. And in Canada, you're never going to get the attention that Toronto, they suck out all the oxygen because all the media headquarters are in Toronto. So it's right. They're both fans. They grew up having, none of those guys, player or analysts, have probably seen their team win a cup in their life, to be fair, right? So I feel like Montreal's path to becoming the Yankees, so to speak, or the Cowboys is through global, is to have like, okay, I get it. You sell the rights to TSN, RDS, whatever, but you could have a global $1 a month streaming to anybody in Europe. You know what I mean? Like just geo-targeted kind of thing. More games abroad. You know, like you have Slavkovsky, he's Slovakian. I don't think he's Slovenian.
Yeah, Slovakian. Yeah.
Slovakian. Go play a game in Bratislava or whatever city is in Slovakia, you know?
Well, they're going to Paris next year.
Yeah, well, that's exactly. So that's, so I think if the Habs were to come up with like 3, 4, 5 like tactical things and combine it with their performance now, I really, really, really think that. Oh, and then the other tie-up is with Evenco. They have all these art, which is owned by the Canadiens parent company, Sash. So you get all these artists who roll into town, gladly put up the jersey on stage. As that people do that in every arena. I just think the Habs have this runway to be much more. The problem is just in Montreal, the business culture, it's so local. Like to me, one of the reasons I really respected Guy Laliberté, the founder of Cirque du Soleil, is his ambition didn't end at the border. He built a global company. Right. But to Brendan's earlier point, I don't know how many people, I mean, especially now that Cirque is no longer owned by him, I'm not so sure if people have that same goodwill with like a Cirque du Soleil, despite it being a local export, because it went global so quickly and so on such a high scale that people probably associate it more with like Las Vegas, you know what I mean? But the Canadiens, I feel they just have this tremendous upside, but I don't know if they care because it's hard from a business to justify why do we care about like viewers in Japan, but they should. But again, who am I?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I
Right?
agree.
Sure, that's the way they look at it.
Yeah. So somebody asked about Halifax in the comments. So Halifax for our global and American is like Atlantic. Think of like Cape Cod, go north. It's like Boston, go up. The population's like 500,000. So that already is a non-starter. I don't pretend to be an expert on Halifax, but if what Brendan and I were saying about Quebec City not having headquarters, I don't know how many businesses there are that would support the kind of ticket prices. And, the reality is one of the reasons why the Expos left and one of the reasons why the Canadiens struggled at some point, although with the Canadiens, they were always a rich team, is the currency. At the end of the day, Canadian teams are collecting in a lot of revenue through ticket sales and whatever. Because don't forget, hockey's broadcast deals are not lucrative. Forget NFL, right. Not even NBA or even MLB levels. Right. So you're ultimately relying, your largest revenue source is local currency, 140 USD CAD conversion. But your salaries, when you're negotiating with, forget the Leighton Hudsons, or when you're negotiating with the free agents, they're thinking American currency, right? So, absolutely. Yeah, and then add to that the Gary Bettman hating Canadians and the league just wanting to be bigger in the States. That I've never been to Halifax. I do hear it's a very nice city. I just don't see that. And I do think like in the pecking order, yeah, like maybe a second team. Oh, yeah, and then the other thing is the second team in Toronto. I don't see why the Maple Leafs would go that. Why would they split up their market? You could make an argument that Jeff Molson is a governor, and I'm not suggesting any impropriety, but just from like a business Machiavellian sense, Jeff Molson is still a very powerful owner in the league. Why would he okay, he's a fan. I'm sure there's a level of altruism. The rivalry is good. We got enough rivalries. Why would he split up his market overnight? And you said a third, it could be half. Why would you give up half of your back market to Quebec, right? So, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the paradox and tragedy of the NHL is that, what you got, keep. Like the Jets left to Phoenix and they got another team. But, I mean, there's not going to be a team in Regina or Saskatoon or many other places. So, yeah, I'm not sure if Halifax is even in the consideration, but not lack of merit, just the reality.
Just the market. The market is not big enough to
the market's not big enough. And I mean, at the end of the day, sports is really, really big business. It's expensive. You're paying millionaires who are not at all like the way that players used to be with like loyalty to a team and all that. So, I think this is it. The Canadiens, these are the teams we have, and we got to save them, lose them, and then you're never getting them back,
Yep, absolutely. I'd like to highlight one more comment that we got, which says, WatchMojo can have a huge impact on getting more people into hockey, which is a very nice sentiment. Thank you for that. And I recommend that you check out our channel called The Lineup.
Yeah, our lineup. So we'll be going more in sports. But before plugging the lineup, Brendan, I'd love to talk a little bit. Tell me about the book. How many books have you written, first of all? Because I always knew you as like a media guy, was a columnist. I mean, I've written books, but it's always impressive when I meet people that take the time to write books. How many books have you written?
So it's 2 books, but it's the same book. I mean, adapted. First book was in French, Le CH et son peuple. So I wrote that, was published in October of 2024, and it just come out now, hot off the presses, as we say. Habs Nation, A People's History of the Montreal Canadiens. basically the same book, though I did add a chapter because it's in English, and the book is really about the relationship between the team and its home province. And so that means mostly with French people, because that's most of what Quebec is. So I added a chapter about the relationship with English Montreal called Trumping the Two Solitudes, a little wordplay in there. And it really, what the book is it makes a parallel between the history of the Canadiens and the history of Quebec. And it was really fascinating to look at. We talked about the Maurice Richard riot being a catalyst for the Quiet Revolution, but you also look at the great teams from the 1970s, and it was this incredible, booming hockey team. Well, it was also an incredible booming city, and it was a sense of effervescence, and Montreal was a happening place. And it was also the beginning of the rise of nationalism with the Parti Québécois, the separatist nationalist party here. And then you look at 1980, when that dynasty falls apart. Well, what also happens in 1980 is the first sovereignty referendum in Quebec, which is a resounding defeat for the nationalists. And the whole of Quebec society goes into a bit of a funk in the 1980s. The economy's mucked up. People are not in a good mood. Well, the same thing happens to the Canadiens. So it's really making these parallels. And I have to say, I pitched this book from the beginning. It's not a book about hockey. It's a book about culture. I'm essentially a cultural columnist who started this What the Puck column 10 years ago as a hockey fan. But I look at the Canadiens as a cultural entity. And I look at it as, if you read this book, Habs Nation, it's a history of the Habs from the 60s till today, but it's also a history of Quebec. And as a history of Quebec, it's a history of Canada. The two referendums, the Meech Lake Accord, the fight for to repatriate the Constitution. The history of the country's there, seen via the parallel with the sports team. I think it's a point of view that I don't think has been put out there before. So I talked to hockey players like Bob Gainey, like Serge Savard, but I also talked to filmmakers like Denis Arcand, who made the Les Invasions Barbares, which won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film. And I talked to Sébastien Fréchette, who's an author and a hip-hop artist. I talked to Viggo Mortensen. I went all the way to Madrid. Amazing. Meet Viggo, star of Lord of the Rings. And there's my dog getting excited by the mention of Viggo. Went to Madrid to meet with Viggo Mortensen, and he's like the number one Habs fan. It's an amazing story. So it's as much cultural as it is sports.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really very insightful. I know we've been wanting to do this for a while. And yes, with us dipping our toes into the podcast format, as well as relaunching the lineup, launching the lineup to go deeper in sports. I felt, and then the season starting, I was like, you know what? No more excuses. Let's do this. So thank you very much for.
Well, thanks for the invite, guys. It was a great kind of different discussion, because it was from the kind of WatchMojo perspective. It's not just another Habs podcast.
Yeah, and it's also not like, somebody asked, would the Habs trade Arbor Xhekaj? I don't think the Habs should ever trade Arbor Xhekaj.
I love the guy.
If they trade Arbor Xhekaj's only mission in life is going to be to destroy every single Habs player. When he's please, Mr. Gorton, Mr. Hughes, if you're watching, just think of the fear factor. Never keep him and his brother forever. Insurance policy. You need to protect those players. Talk about Semenko. You're talking about Gretzky. You do need to protect players. I don't care about the era.
They will not be trading Arbor Xhekaj anytime soon.
Yeah, no, exactly. But somebody asked, and I want to touch it. Okay, and then rarely, I know we covered America, censorship, capitalism, AI. Exceptionally, just because Netflix, our friends at Netflix, are going to be launching the Expos documentary, Who Killed the Montreal Expos. Next week, we're going to do Inside Expos, just to talk a little bit about a number of related things to the Expos, as well as break down the podcast. So hopefully the viewers will tune in for that. And again, Brendan, don't be a stranger. We can do this again. And as we launch the lineup, more and more emphasis on it, we could probably do even more sports and culture related stuff.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So thank you.
Terrific.
Thanks
very
a lot,
much, guys.
guys.
Cheers.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
See you.